So we are now recording, and I want to introduce Dr. Ellen Wohl. She has told me to refer to her as Ellen from this point onward, so I will. Thank you, Ellen. Ellen is a professor of geosciences at CSU, and I read her bio before the call this morning, and she is well respected and highly published. You're a river expert is the best sort of summary of the bio that I could come up with. Ellen has studied river systems on every continent on the planet except for Antarctica. Are there river systems in Antarctica? I guess that's one question you can answer. But today she's focusing on Beaver in Colorado, and I wanted to welcome Ellen to the conversation.
Thank you. I'll just do the share screen and we can go ahead and get started. Okay, let's just, all right, I'm going to get rid of these, the meeting controls. There we go. Okay, so beavers in Colorado. As Jeffrey said, I'm in geosciences, so I want to emphasize that I am not a biologist. I don't know much about beavers as organisms except what I've read about them, but I do know a lot about what they do in river systems. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today. And you may recognize this photo for some of you who've been over into the upper part of the Poudre catchment. This is in Hague Creek in the park. And we'll see if the slides will advance. Okay, sorry. Got a frozen slide here. That's interesting. There we go. Okay, so I think just by way of background in thinking about what beavers do, it's important to understand how much we humans have altered rivers, large and small, from the very smallest creeks up to the biggest rivers on individual continents like the Mississippi, the Colorado, the Columbia in our part of the world. So certainly throughout the Northern Hemisphere, we as humans have mostly made rivers simpler. The contrasting photos here, the Poudre, this photo that I'm showing in the lower left, it doesn't look like that anymore. There was a river restoration project a few years ago, and it looks very different now, but that was channelized in the 1960s. So channelization means you just make a river straight, as opposed to the Yukon River that you're seeing on the right, which is very sinuous. It moves back and forth across the valley floor through time. There are cut-off meanders and oxbow lakes, and a lot of what we've done is to make rivers more efficient at moving things downstream. And the things have been water, like floodwaters, or we've made them simpler and homogeneous for navigation or for waste disposal. There's a nasty history of putting lousy things in rivers, just get them away from us. So for a variety of reasons, we've engineered channels, we've regulated the flow through dams and diversions to make the flow less variable through time. We've removed anything that might obstruct the flow. So beavers and their dams, in-stream wood here refers to log jams. And I think all of us, and I definitely include myself, if we could magically go back in time 200 years, we would be shocked probably at how different most rivers and floodplains looked. I could use the Big Thompson in Estes Park, for example. That would have been a river that had a lot of wetlands along it. There's evidence of a lot of past beaver dams. You would have seen a river that moved much more slowly and irregularly downstream, more like what you see in that photo in the lower right here from Alaska. So you can think of this simplification as a loss of spatial heterogeneity. And spatial heterogeneity sounds like a mouthful, but it's just referring to patches on the channel and the adjacent floodplain. You can see those in the example from Alaska. If you can see my cursor here, there's standing water in wetlands. These lighter green patches are ponds that have gradually filled in and they're being colonized by different types of vegetation. So there was a lot more of this patchiness in river corridors. And I use river corridor to refer to the active channel in the floodplain. And if you have a system like you're seeing in the lower right, everything moves downstream more slowly. So water, anything dissolved in the water, sediment, organic material like bits of leaves and pine needles and large wood. So that's what I mean by affecting the downstream fluxes of these materials. They move more efficiently in something that's channelized and homogenized like the Poudre. That's why we did that type of homogenization. And there are very, very strong effects on characteristics like water quality. If everything moves downstream more quickly, then you end up with a large amount of material entering either receiving lakes or the ocean. I'm guessing that many of you have heard of the dead zone that occurs every year off the mouth of the Mississippi. That's from the huge amount of nitrogen that gets pumped into the Gulf of Mexico. And there are various reasons for that. It's the Mississippi is draining our agricultural region, so there's a lot of excess nitrogen coming off of fertilizers. But we've also reduced the ability of the river to biologically process that nitrogen. So there are these implications for water quality, just the amount of organisms, insects, fish, other creatures that can be supported by that river corridor, and certainly the diversity of those organisms. So one way to think about river networks, and this applies very, very well to rivers in the Front Range, is this very simple idea of beads and strings. So here's North St. Vrain Creek in a Google Earth view. The big white arrow is just indicating flow direction. The lower part is in Wild Basin. So the string is a steep, narrow portion that's confined pretty tightly by the valley walls. The bead here is the big beaver meadow that's present in Wild Basin. It's a wide, shallow portion of the river where you have space to develop more of that patchiness or heterogeneity. And the beads, it turns out, are disproportionately important in river networks. They tend to retain things. And if you think of, again, water, sediment, whatever it may be, moving down a steep, narrow portion of a river network, it's going to move pretty fast. It comes into a place like this, there's multiple channels, there's ponds, there's three-dimensional movement of materials through laterally and vertically into the subsurface. So if you slow down the movement of those things, there's a chance for everything from microbes to aquatic insects to fish to begin to take up some of those nutrients. So you tend to have a lot more biological productivity in those areas. And again, that retention of the material really reflects that patchiness or that spatial heterogeneity and the ability for material to spread across the floodplain, so to move laterally and to go into the subsurface vertically. The beads are also the places that can absorb change, whether it's something like wildfire or flood or whatever we may do that disturbs the river network. So if we look at the Upper Colorado, for example, a zoomed out version of Google Earth, around Grand Lake, as you start to zoom in, I've just highlighted with yellow here, you can see these lighter green patches on the valley floors or in the floodplains, and you zoom in, and this is a good example of a bead. If you look upstream here, again, the white arrow is indicating flow direction. There's a channel there. I think that's North Inlet Creek. That's steep and narrow. Then it comes down into this wide, low gradient portion. The river becomes much more sinuous. Some of those bends cut off. Beavers build dams. There's a lot of retention there. So this is what a string looks like on the ground. This is, again, on the west side of the park. Steep, narrow. There's not a lot of storage. There's not much of a floodplain, if any. By contrast, a bead, this is in that meadow that you were just looking at, there's a lot of storage in there, water, sediment, nutrients. So there's also a lot of habitat and a lot of biodiversity. And I use that term river corridor. This is just a three-dimensional block diagram that to emphasize that if most people say river, all of us tend to think of the channel, end of story. But a river corridor, if you use that phrase, it really makes it more explicit that you're talking about the channel, but also the adjacent floodplain and the underlying hyporeic zone. And hyporeic is a mouthful. It's from Greek roots that mean hypo is below and reic or rios is flow. So it's flow beneath the river. In rivers where you have sediment underneath as opposed to bedrock, you could think of it as a parallel subsurface river. There's flow in the subsurface that moves more slowly, but it comes from the river, goes into the subsurface and returns to the river. And during that period of passage underground, there are microbial communities that are very important for removing excess nutrients like nitrogen and nitrate. That underground travel period also helps to keep the water cooler, which is really important for our native salmonids and our introduced salmonids. All the trout basically need cold water. So you can look at this block diagram and think about I've got water and solutes here, dissolved material. There are these surface pathways. There's things coming in from the adjacent uplands, during the rains like we just had. There's water and solutes moving downstream. If you have high enough flow, it goes out onto the floodplain, and then some of that comes back. So this is all lateral and longitudinal or downstream movement. But there's also this vertical movement. So this is water that goes into the stream bank, goes through the subsurface, comes back. It's going into and out of the bed. There's water that originates from outside of the river corridor that's coming in and can be welling up into the river, or river water can be going down into the subsurface. So I'm emphasizing this because a fully functional river has these three dimensions of connectivity. It's not just water moving downstream. And much of what our simplification and engineering of channels has done is to limit this lateral connectivity and limit the vertical. We've just tried to get water downstream as fast as possible. So going back to that idea of beads and strings, those wider bead portions have much more strongly developed three-dimensional connectivity. And you can really understand that thinking about river corridors rather than just channels. Okay, so spatial heterogeneity, I sometimes refer to it as messiness. As opposed to just a simple river flowing downstream, a spatially heterogeneous or messy river, it might split into multiple channels. It would have areas of ponded water from log jams. It could have cut-off meanders that are forming lakes or beaver dams and ponds. It's not what most of us think of as just a simple, straightforward river. But again, zooming in on North Inlet Creek, you can see the active channel here, but if you look where my cursor is going, you can also see examples of where the channel has been in the recent past. And channels naturally move back and forth across the valley floor. So they create these abandoned meanders, and hopefully you can see the difference in the color there. That's reflecting differences in the material underlying the surface. There's probably more fine sediment like silt and clay there. It's often wetter soil. So you get a different plant community than all of the animals that go with the plants, again, from microbes through insects, birds, etc. So there's that habitat diversity associated with this history of movement of the river. And another example, I'm sorry, it's not very well in focus. This is from Google Earth, but North Fork Lake Creek near Independence Pass. You can see the highway there. There's a whole series of very active beaver dams that are creating a lot of spatial heterogeneity and making this a very inefficient river in terms of getting things downstream fast. But that's a good thing for many reasons, and I'll explain those in a moment. So you can look at a landscape like this, East Inlet Creek, and think about this connectivity. There's things coming off of the adjacent uplands, and again, the things are water, sediment, organic material, dissolved material, both in the surface, which is the solid arrow here, and then in the subsurface, like groundwater. There's this vertical exchange. Of course, rain and snowfall on the channel, and you probably are very aware of the issues with atmospheric deposition in the park. We have a lot of nitrate that's being deposited. It's coming from where I live to where you live. So it's coming from the base of the mountains and the big urban and agricultural corridor, moving in with the upslope winds and being deposited on the east side. During fires, you have a lot of material, some really nasty stuff like mercury, but also just ash and charcoal. Going the other direction, of course, water evaporates. You've got aquatic insects that hatch out. So there's this vertical connectivity. And then this dashed line is supposed to indicate that vertical connectivity into the subsurface with water and the lateral connectivity of the channel and floodplain. So I mentioned that this messiness or spatial heterogeneity can increase resilience. And I'm using resilience just to indicate the ability to absorb or recover after disturbance. And these are all pictures of Wild Basin on the east side, that beautiful beaver meadow there. This is off channel over on one side of the valley, and this is three small channels coming together. You can see the difference in vegetation, and I'm guessing all of you have been there. It's a very dense willow carr. If you're not familiar with that term, it's C-A-R-R. It's a type of wetland that has woody shrubs. So, we've got the well drained slopes up here on the lateral moraine from the glacier, the conifer forests, and then there's this amazing wetland in the base. That's very resilient to drought and fire. It's wet, so it doesn't burn, it doesn't dry out as much. After the 2013 flood, I'd been working up here and I was desperate to see what this place looked like after the flood. And first the roads were all washed out, so I couldn't get up from the base of the mountains. And then the national park closed because our government had one of its periodic shutdowns. But when I did finally get in here, I went to the upstream end, which is where I've got the cursor here. And you all, if you've lived here, you know what happened downstream on North St. Vrain during the 2013 flood. There were massive landslides, a lot of damage in lions. I couldn't even tell there had been a flood when I got up here. There was some deposition of large wood and coarse sediment at the upstream end. But if you look at this lower photo, if you've ever tried to walk off trail at Wild Basin, it's kind of a miserable experience. It's really hard to force your way through those willows. And it's the same thing with the flood. The floodwaters came in there and they just slowed and settled and spread everywhere. So this is a really good buffer. Areas like this, these beads that are fully functional when you have a disturbance like a flood. And an example of how, in this case, beaver modifications in a bead can increase resilience to fire. This is a site in Idaho, and my colleague Joe Wheaton took this photo. It was several years ago now, but you can see it was just a couple weeks after the fire. The adjacent uplands were completely burned, but there's this ribbon of green in the parts where there's that high water table and ponded water associated with the beaver activity and the patchiness that that creates. So within beads in our part of the world, in the Rocky Mountains, the spatial heterogeneity, or that patchiness, the three-dimensional connectivity, and the resilience are all enhanced by a couple of features that I've taken to calling biotic drivers. It's just a scientific fancy name for log jams and beaver dams. Those create the obstructions. They create the ponded water. They force the channels to go back and forth across the valley floor. And what I didn't mention with hypereic flow, that's that flow below the surface of the channel, that's driven by pressure changes. So if you have an obstacle in the flow, like a beaver dam or a log jam, that forces water into that hypereic zone. And often the water will upwell back into the channel just below that. So the more obstructions you have, like beaver dams or log jams, the more of that vertical connectivity you have. And those obstructions are also limiting downstream movement of water. So the water's being forced onto the floodplain. So you've got more lateral connectivity as well. So beavers are often referred to as ecosystem engineers. That's a term that can be used for a variety of plants and animals, but it means that they, in the course of going through their activities and living their life cycle, they modify the area around them in a way that strongly affects other organisms. So they create habitat for other creatures. And in the case of beavers, they're increasing that lateral and vertical connectivity where they build dams. And I'm guessing all of you know there are what are called bank beavers. That's exactly the same species. They're just beavers that live in rivers that are too large to dam. So they can still live there, but they don't build a dam across the river. So where the river is sufficiently small, the beavers can increase lateral and vertical connectivity with their dams. They create that surface water storage and really raise the water table in the riparian zone or the river corridor. These are pictures from last summer in the Fall River, in that downstream grazing exposure that apparently, what do they call them? They've got a name for them. There's a moose that can jump that enormously high fence. The Park Service has video of this moose doing it. They call him Atlas or something funny like that. But if you've been in that site, and if you haven't, I encourage you to go. There's been an amazing transformation there in the last 4 years. A pair of beavers moved in. They started building dams. So this upper left photo, what you're seeing obviously is a dam with water going over it. But this lower photo, that's not a dam. That's the top of the bank above the Fall River. These photos were taken last August, so it's base flow. The beavers have flooded the entire valley bottom. So there's water spilling everywhere. If you do go in there, you can just go in the grazing exclosure. Definitely take chest waders if you've got them, or just be prepared to get very wet, because there are hidden holes. And there's one that I stepped in. We were going back and forth making measurements, and I think I stepped in the same hole 5 times, and all of a sudden it was up to my chest. It's like, I like beavers, but I don't like their holes. But they raise the water table very effectively, and there's a beautiful example of this now on the Fall River. And if you're spreading water across this densely vegetated surface, there's a lot of what's called hydraulic roughness, which sounds kind of intimidating, but it's just the water can't move as fast. And if you've got a smooth-walled straight channel, the water moves pretty fast. You spread it out through these dense willows, it's going to move much more slowly. Some of it is going into the subsurface. So you're limiting the height of the flood peak, or the amount of water that's moving downstream quickly. You're spreading it out through time. And some of that water that goes into the subsurface comes back into the channel later in the summer and the autumn. So you're increasing the base flow period, or the lowest flow, which is really good for fish in particular. And it's good for downstream communities, including consumptive users like ranchers as well. There's also a lot of sediment being stored in there, and a lot of organic matter, which just means logs, twigs, pine needles, everything that plants leave when they die or as they're continuing to grow. So these pictures are both from a place called Little Beaver Creek. It's a tributary of the South Fork Poudre on the east side. And the picture below are abandoned beaver ponds. They had been abandoned before the Cameron Peak fire, but of course we've had a huge amount of sediment coming off of these slopes since the Cameron Peak fire in 2020. This photo was taken last summer. There was a large debris flow in this catchment, and you can see the old beaver pond is full to the rim with sediment. So that's a really good way to attenuate sediment flows downstream. And this is a pond. There was an active dam that breached during that big flood, but you can see the organic material. It's very black, organic, rich soil, and things like logs that are buried and stored in these ponds. And water managers, those who are in charge of supplying our drinking water, want to keep a lot of things out of it. Sediment, for obvious reasons, it clogs the filters. Even dissolved organic matter, like dissolved carbon, it doesn't hurt us at all. You can drink lots of it and it wouldn't hurt you, but it makes the water taste funny and it gives it a color, and people don't like that. So water treatment facilities try to remove that dissolved organic matter, and the standard treatment is to add chlorine. They try to keep the dissolved organic matter out of the water, though, because if you add chlorine to dissolved organic matter, you get byproducts that are carcinogens or cancer-causing agents. So if you have a landscape that has lots of beaver dams and beaver ponds and this natural storage that limits the movement of that material down into your drinking water reservoirs, that's a big benefit as well. The beaver ponds are also nitrogen sinks. N just stands for nitrogen, and we have a severe problem with excess nitrogen in Front Range rivers all the way up to the Continental Divide. The beavers, by slowing down the velocity of the flow, make the channels more stable, so that can limit sediment moving downstream, and they provide habitat and biodiversity for a lot of creatures. I said it's really difficult to move through the willows in Wild Basin. I was doing that a few years ago, and I came out and there were mama and baby about 6 feet away, and her hackles went up, and I've never moved that fast in chest waders, but she didn't charge, and they did cross safely. The baby almost got swept downstream. This was the start of peak flow, but it was interesting because the mother moose got downstream of the calf, and she was like a bulwark protecting it. So a few of the creatures that you can see in beaver meadows. There's also that black soil stores a lot of carbon. And now a variety of organizations, from the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management to groups like the Nature Conservancy, are really interested in enhancing beaver populations, because that's a way of creating carbon sequestration points. You can take carbon out of the atmosphere and store it in these organic rich soils. So we know there were a lot more beaver present historically in North America, in Colorado, and in Rocky Mountain National Park. And before this talk, Joanna and Jeffrey and I were talking about Enos Mills's 1913 book in Beaver World. If you haven't read it, I strongly recommend it. It's really fun. But he describes things that we can only dream of, like grizzly bears or a wolf pack attacking a beaver colony. It's like, oh, I wish I could see that. Maybe with paws on the ground, we'll at least see the wolves again. But there were a lot more beaver. And what I'm showing here, this is the upper Poudre River just downstream of Poudre Lake in the park. So the white arrow is indicating flow direction. This dashed white line, that's an old beaver dam that's been completely stabilized and vegetated. And this is the old pond upstream of it. It's got Calamagrostis, which is very characteristic of abandoned beaver ponds growing there. If you walk down this part of the upper Poudre Trail, so as if you're going to Mirror Lake or Hague Creek, and you go off trail and walk down in the valley, there are dozens and dozens of these abandoned dams. This was a very rich area for beaver. And certainly there are abandoned dams like this that, again, are completely vegetated and stabilized pretty much everywhere I've gone in the park. I've gone up to some of the subalpine lakes, like Timber Lake, Mirror Lake, Hidden Lake. There's old beaver dams all over the place. The beaver aren't there now, but there were high population densities of beaver in the past. So what happens if the beaver disappear? There's a phrase that ecologists use that is, again, it's kind of a mouthful. It's alternative states. But see, it's the idea that if you look at 2 points on a landscape, you look at 1 point on a landscape, let's say Wild Basin, there are at least 2 very different configurations that landscape could assume under current conditions. And each of them would be stable and persistent, but they're very, very different. So I'll show you an example of this. The most famous example of this alternative state is beaver meadows versus elk grasslands. So if you have a beaver that's able to build a dam and multiple dams, you have this self-enhancing feedback. The dam is an obstruction of the flow. It creates that backwater pond. It creates overbank flow. As water flows across a floodplain that's got an irregular surface, especially if beavers are digging canals in it, you're going to have secondary channels that start to form. So instead of just moving downstream in one channel, the flow is branching into secondary channels that then rejoin downstream. So you've got these multiple channels, you've got a very high water table that favors the willows, aspen, river birch, choke cherry, some of the other native species that like a lot of water. You get these extensive floodplain wetlands. That's great habitat and food for the beavers. So you have more beavers staying in the area, you get more dams and ponds. So it's a self-enhancing feedback in that these things feed into each other. The beavers are very persistent. So it's spatially extensive. It can occupy the whole floodplain. It can be very persistent. We did a study in Wild Basin, and because it was a national park, we could only use hand tools. We couldn't have a big truck-mounted corer, but we took hand cores, so we could go down about 3.5 feet. And we used something called radiocarbon dating to determine the age of the sediment at the base of that. And it was 5,000 years old. And then we used something called ground penetrating radar that sends radar waves into the surface, and you get a reflection that you can interpret to understand what's below you. The bottom line is we know that beaver have been present in Wild Basin for at least 5,000 years and probably longer. So if the habitat is good, they can persist there for a very long time. It's very spatially heterogeneous or complex. It's got strong three-dimensional connectivity. And as long as the beavers stay there, you can maintain this. That's a beaver meadow. The other side is the elk grassland. Something causes the beaver to disappear. And of course, in Rocky Mountain, the something was initially commercial fur trapping, and then subsequently the very high population density of the elk that were reintroduced from Yellowstone. So if the beavers disappear, their dams fall into disrepair and are washed out. You lose that backwater and overbank flow. You're concentrating all of the snowmelt peak or any summer thunderstorms in a single channel. There's a lot more flow energy. So that channel cuts down and those banks start to erode. And this is Beaver Brook in Upper Beaver Meadows. That becomes a self-enhancing feedback too, in the sense that as the channel has more energy, it cuts down, it widens, it drains the whole adjacent area. So it becomes this, this photo was taken a few years ago. They've got some grazing exclosures in there now, but those are some sad little remnants of willows that the elk and moose hadn't gotten to yet. It's still green compared to the adjacent conifer slopes, but it's a much drier environment and much simpler than an active beaver meadow like Wild Basin. And now it's going to stay this way. It's very hard for beaver to build a dam that will persist through snowmelt in a deeply cut channel like this. Some of you may have seen the Park Service is putting in what are called beaver dam analogs. They're human-built beaver dams or little wooden dams in the channel. And they did that at the Fall River, and the beaver that are present there built on top of the beaver dam. I love thinking about the beaver coming along and saying, we can do better than that, and fixing it. But the Park Service is doing this on Cow Creek and also in Upper Beaver Meadows, and they're talking about doing it on several sites on the western side of the park as well. So I think the key thing is either one of these is stable and persistent. They're completely different scenarios, but each will persist unless something disturbs the system. So the disturbance in the upper part would be taking the beaver out. The disturbance in the bottom would be mainly humans coming in and limiting the access by the big ungulates like elk and moose, and probably putting in structures that will help the beaver become reestablished. So again, that upper scenario with the beaver meadow, much more resilient to disturbance, takes up a lot of that excess nitrogen, stores carbon, and promotes that much higher level of biodiversity. So why don't people want beavers everywhere? And they don't. I think my impression is humans have a bipolar response to beavers. You either really like them or you really don't like them. And there's there's not that many people who are neutral, who actually spend time on the land. So we don't like them because they can dam structures that we don't want dams on, like culverts under roads or irrigation intakes. When they raise the water level, as in the pond here, that can submerge roads, other property, different types of infrastructure. I remember when there was an active beaver colony on Fish Creek downstream from the Chaley Ranch, and I was out there looking at them one day, and they were really taking down the aspens. And I was talking to a local landowner in the Fish Creek Road neighborhood, and he was very upset because of the loss of riparian trees. So people don't want riparian trees cut down. And initially, when a beaver flood an area, you do have an increase in methane emissions. Methane is carbon and hydrogen. It's a gas that's a very potent greenhouse gas. That's a fairly temporary effect, but you do have an increase in greenhouse gas emissions initially. So why do people want beavers? Well, there's that lateral and vertical connectivity that I've been mentioning across the river corridor and in the subsurface. There's the storage and the higher riparian water table, the attenuation of flood peaks and the increase of base flow. And I should say, ranchers in Colorado and other sort of intermountain West states have been very opposed to beavers in the past, but they're really starting to come around because now there have been some studies that show that beaver activity can increase base flow during the late part of the growing season. So there's a growing movement of ranchers who are, the phrase that's commonly used is our beaver believers. They're becoming more of the fans of beaver. They can promote that dense, woody riparian vegetation. And again, the roughness that slows down the passage of flood flows and stores sediment and nutrients, improve the water quality, improve channel stability, which means you have less sediment going downstream, creating that habitat and biodiversity and carbon storage. So it's hazards versus benefits. But one of the things that I find really interesting is there are cycles or fashions in, I suppose, in everything we do as humans, but certainly in river management and restoration. So people started reintroducing beavers to rivers during the Dust Bowl in the 1930s. The Civilian Conservation Corps had a big movement to do this. There was another phase in the 50s. I don't know if you're aware of it, but there was another really Dust Bowl episode in the 50s. It was particularly severe in eastern Colorado. There was another phase in the 1980s, and we're currently in a phase. So this is a national guidebook that's freely available online. It's put together, if you look at who it's prepared by, the Fish and Wildlife Service, NOAA, the Forest Service. It's everything about beavers, including how to actively reintroduce them, but it is gaining again. And there are tools online. This is the BRAT, the Beaver Restoration Assessment Tool, that allows you to use freely available data that's publicly accessible to figure out what the carrying capacity of a portion of the river might be for beaver. And one of my master's students did this analysis for the whole state. So the areas that are red cannot support beaver. And if you look at them, they're the big rivers. They're too big for beavers. And you can see that the places that are ideal are mostly in the mountains, although notice there's some little patches where I've got my cursor moving here, little dots of green, all the way down to the border with Nebraska. So beavers are not just mountain species. They can be anywhere in the state, but the best habitat tends to be in the mountains. But you can also use BRAT to estimate past conditions. So there are different layers in this, the size of the streams, the underlying topography, the type of vegetation present, and people have estimated the type of vegetation present prior to European settlement. So you can look at BRAT 200 years ago, and this map is showing change. So the key things are the hot colors, the reds. There's been a dramatic loss in beaver habitat. So there's still suitable beaver habitat, particularly in the mountainous portion of the state, but there's this widespread loss for a variety of reasons. Either maybe the flow is still there and the valley geometry is good, but there's no food because, say, elk and moose or humans have built golf courses next to it or something, but there's not enough of that winter food for the beaver in the form of willows. I want to emphasize this part. I started with beaver hazards and I talked about beaver benefits. A lot of the hazards are pretty easy to prevent. So this website that I've got here there are multiple small companies that sell these now, but beaver deceivers, if this is presumably a deceived and frustrated beaver there, you just put a fence in the pond around whatever it is you don't want the beaver to dam, like a culvert, or you can see here an irrigation intake structure. And if you've got high value trees you want to protect, you can put small fences around them and they work quite well. There are also things called beaver pond levelers. You just put a flexible PVC tube in the pond through the dam, and that prevents the water level from exceeding a certain height. And you have to put a little fence around it like this, but these are not extremely expensive or high-tech solutions. They just require willingness on the part of the landowner to accommodate the beaver and allow them to exist without creating some of the hazards that people would prefer not to have. So again, beaver dam analogs, there's a lot of things they're called. In Rocky Mountain National Park, they're actually called simulated beaver structures, but they're human-built dams. Sometimes they look like this. This is what the ones in the park now look like. They almost look like wooden steps or riffles in the channel. This is Campbell Creek. It's north of Fort Collins in the foothills. This is Fish Creek in Estes Park. This is one consulting group that built some. This is right by the Fish Creek Road. This is on the Chile Ranch property, and they used beaver chewed wood to build that one. So they're really quite natural looking. And then I had a student who was monitoring these, and we came out, they looked like they did in the last photo. And the next week they look like this. The beaver just took off. There were beaver present at the site and built a huge dam and pond. So it was really impressive how quickly they could do this. So again, if you have private landowners like the Chiles that are amenable to this, it's a really nice thing that you can do for river corridors and really improve a lot of the function and the habitat. And again, I just wanted to emphasize that beaver can be everywhere in Colorado. This is down on the Fox Ranch. It's a nature conservancy preserve. This is a Google Earth view. I pointed out one beaver dam, but there's a whole series here. I was initially there in February, and it looks like there's almost no water in there, but actually we went in chest waders and we had to stop because we were about to overtop. So there's a very deep pond right there. This is what it looks like in summer. There's not that many big willows, but the beavers are building the dam mostly out of finer sediment like silt and clay and sand, and then using some of the willows that are mostly maybe the size of my index finger, at most my wrist. I've seen beaver use everything in dams, from old tires to a full moose rack. They're pretty adaptable. They'll use what's available to dam up the flow. So coming back to some of these management issues, if you want to get some of these great benefits, the beads themselves, the wide portions of the river corridor don't go away. But as humans, we can change the functionality of those by doing things like removing beaver or logjam. So how many do we need? Historically, and I've drawn these exaggerated so you can see the beads, a river network in many parts of our country would have looked something like this. Now, most of them look more like this. There's very few functional beads left. So particularly with the Biden administration's infusion of funds, the Forest Service, the Park Service are doing a lot of green infrastructure building, and they're doing things like putting in these simulated beaver dams. So where should we do this? Should we focus on a few downstream? Or should we be looking at where I live, like the Poudre coming into the Great Plains or North St. Vrain or some of the others, or should we be focused up in the headwaters? And the preliminary results from some of the work that I and others have been doing suggest that it's really better to focus on these smaller sites in the headwaters, which is nice because those are mostly public lands in Colorado. So that's a little more feasible to work with the Forest Service and the Park Service. But I think I'll just end by saying this, I see this as an opportunity to address some of these questions using partnerships between research scientists and the people who are interested in protecting land, as you are, or the practitioners who are putting these structures in. And if you're interested in learning more about beavers, there are a lot of great books. I wrote one a couple of years ago that focuses on Wild Basin as sort of the microcosm that reflects the macrocosm. But the other two I'd really strongly recommend are in Beaver World. That it's just fun to read. And Lily Pond, which was written back in '89, she's Hope Ryden, I'm not sure if she's still alive, but she is a biologist, and she was focusing on a colony of beavers in upstate New York. And that is just an absolute delight to read. Each of these has a slightly different focus, like Fur, Fortune, and Empire, and Once They Were Hats are by environmental historians. Eager, I think, is probably the most well-known one that a lot of people have enjoyed. Beaverland just came out at the end of last year. Both Eager and Beaverland talk a lot about humans interacting with beavers. So there's a lot to read because many of us like beavers and like to write about them. So I think, oh yeah, I had to end with this great photo, which is not mine, but it was this really nice National Geographic photo. You can see the Tetons in the background. And I am more than happy to answer questions if you have any. Thank you.
Ellen, we have one question in the chat box.
Actually,
if you want to take a look at that.
Yeah, let me see. I think I'll stop sharing. Well, yeah, I'll stop sharing my screen to make it a little easier to look at the chat box. Okay, from John Guffey, thank you. Okay, so it's some very complimentary things that I won't read out. I'm going to read these out loud so that they're the question and answer in the recording. Thank you very much for the compliments. How can we help the beaver and nurture their restorative presence? I think there's particularly those of you in the Estes Valley Land Trust, there's one key thing that the park needs, and that is, everybody loves moose and elk. I like seeing moose and elk. There's nothing wrong with moose and elk, but they're in unnaturally high densities. And anything we can do to educate visitors or residents about the need to limit their access to the river corridors. I am very excited about the possibility of the wolves moving into Rocky Mountain National Park, because if you're familiar with the Yellowstone story, it's not that they're going to kill all the elk and moose, not anywhere close. We're still going to have plenty of elk and moose. They'll just keep them from behaving like cows and sheep and spending all their time in the river. So it'll give the riparian corridor a chance to recover. And if you're not familiar with that phrase, riparian corridor is just usually refers to primarily the vegetation communities in the floodplain. Beyond that, if you want to do any volunteer work, there are groups like Wildlands Restoration Volunteers, and I know there are others. I'm more familiar with the ones right around me, like the Coalition for the Poudre Watershed, but there must be one for the Big Thompson. These watershed groups are very interested in having volunteers helping with a variety of things, including putting in structures. They're pretty low tech. They're not that difficult to put in. Monitoring how well they're doing. There was a woman named Sherry Tippy who lives in Denver who taught herself to work with beaver and was very active in reintroducing them, relocating them from places where landowners didn't want them to places where they did. I have never met her. I understand she is retired, but so I'm not sure who's doing beaver reintroduction now in our area, but there is a need for people to help with some of these issues. It's not simple to reintroduce beaver. It's if you don't do it well, even if you do it well, there's a high rate of mortality. Beavers are very vulnerable when they're out of the water. So until they establish their pond and lodge, and I should say they dam rivers because their den entrances are underwater, whether they're in the banks or in a lodge. So they have to pond up water so they can have that underwater entrance. And until they have that home habitat established, they're very vulnerable to predation, or if they're introduced at the wrong time of year, they can starve to death, or in a place that doesn't have enough food. So it's not straightforward, but it is very important, and there are groups doing that. So it's a long answer to your question, John, but I'd say help people to understand how important beaver are and why too many big ungulates like elk and moose are a problem. It drives me crazy that the Park Service has no interpretive signs on those grazing exclosures. And I've talked to Park Service people and they keep saying, yeah, we should do that. And I keep saying, why don't you? It's a great opportunity to explain why there are these huge kind of ugly fences in the middle of the park and to explain what they're doing. So anything you can do to help people understand the importance of beaver, and then any activities or any opportunities you have to help with some of these river restoration groups, I think would be great.
Thank you.
I know our office neighbors, the Estes Valley Watershed Coalition, they monitor beaver dams on the or beaver lodges on the Chile property, and they're so small. I'm sure they would be really grateful to have some volunteers, and they do some restoration work related to that.
Yes, thank you. That was the name of the organization I couldn't think of.
I have another question I would like to ask you. This is just more of a pronoun kind of question, but at the very beginning of your presentation, you said that we, being, I assume that just means humans,
Yes.
have done these things to rivers to meet our needs and wants. And it's kind of a generalized term, but it makes me think that all, children, I mean, how can we distinguish between the people that are doing that and those that don't want to do that, or that there's a difference, there's a fight, or there's a kind of a conflict? And I've been trying to get the Estes Park community to embrace the notion that we need to work through those conflicts, and we can't say we until we agree, until we have an understanding or arrive at a consensus. And some people say, well, consensus doesn't work. And so then we fall back into, well, then it's the people in power that get to do what they want to do. And everyone else is just watching. And, how do we avoid not being we, literally? I mean, how do we make the we true? How can we make it more true?
Yeah, that's a good point. I was using we just to refer to humanity. So it's the
Mhm.
biggest we possible. And for much of human history, I know there have been dissenters like Enos Mills or John Muir, are famous examples, but most humans have been pretty much on board with taming nature for human needs. That has been changing over the last couple centuries as we see some of the downsides. Uh, it's a good point, John, that you have to be careful who you mean when you say we. But to your second part of how do we make it more inclusive, I give another talk where I always end with a movie poster. It was a movie that was released a few years ago called No by Gael Garcia Bernal starred in it. It was about the elections in Chile when Pinochet, the dictator there, decided that he was going to run for re-election. And he was leading in the polls, and the opponents could not figure this out because so many horrible things had happened under his regime. And they hired an advertising firm to run a campaign. And basically they said, well, you're going about this wrong. Instead of saying how bad Pinochet is, why don't you present an alternative and say, look how wonderful your life could be if you had these things. So I think about that a lot with science because, I think almost everybody now accepts that climate change is occurring. They may still argue why, but cigarette smoking, asbestos, lead in gasoline. There were so many people who were adamantly opposed to what the scientific evidence was showing. So just communicating scientific understanding is not enough. It's how you communicate it. And maybe part of it with environmental issues is saying, not just, oh, no, we shouldn't do that. You're bad. You shouldn't do that. But saying, oh, look what we could have if we did things differently. So that's a tough one, but that's the best that I've come up with so far, is trying to present a positive alternative and think about what we could have.
Thank you.
And I see a cat face. I'm a cat lover. I'm glad a cat is attending my talk, and a dog. I saw a dog earlier. But we do have a couple questions now. Water management for the Front Range appears to be totally oriented to creating lakes with rapid feed for agriculture. Does water management for the Front Range have better methods that might be modeled after beaver? The first part of that, yeah, that's absolutely how water management has been approached in the past. It's store it. The emphasis is completely on storage. And of course, prior appropriation allows you to move water across continental divides and between different areas, and to sell it between users. I think a lot of the green infrastructure that I was mentioning that's really emphasized by particularly the Forest Service and the Park Service now in our area is oriented more towards keeping water on the landscape and natural storage features. And there was just a bill that was passed in the state legislature, which it's been within the last 2 weeks, that was put forward. Part of the pushback against any form of natural water storage in beaver dams is that consumptive users downstream are worried about losing water rights. So this bill was addressing that and basically saying that, below a certain size, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the pond size off the top of my head, but if there was evidence of past beaver activity, and if the ponds are below a certain size, we're not going to worry about the potential for downstream water rights infringement. So this is a very important bill, and it's really going to help stream restoration in Colorado. So again, Alice, the short version of my answer is yes, we're moving in that direction slowly. I'm saying slowly because I live in Fort Collins, and as of right now, Glade Reservoir is still going forward. And that is the most recent example of just build a big reservoir and store it in there. I'm going to stop. I can go off about Glade for a very long time, and I think it's a really, really bad idea, but I'll just stop there. So we're doing both. We're still building the traditional water projects, but or trying to build the big water projects, and we're doing some more progressive things. But there's a question: once beaver come into an area like Chile, is the assumption that the young will continue to stay in that area and help develop more dams and expand the wetlands? How do river scientists see that effort continue to be helpful and not become a point of conflict with non-public entities? Yeah, that's an important question. So beavers, the kits, when they're first born, they're cared for by their parents and the generation of or their siblings immediately before them. Basically, beavers stay there for up to 2 years. Just like humans, they sometimes go off to found their own colony and then come back and live with their parents when they're fully adults. But the normal pattern is at 2 years, they move out, they establish new dams and colonies. If there is sufficient habitat, they're likely to stay in the same area. And if they can find a mate, they're very, very vulnerable during that period when they're moving to a new habitat. They're subject to predation and they have to find a mate. For those of you who are familiar with Wild Basin, we were working there a few years ago and we were doing nighttime sampling for riparian spiders and bats. And unfortunately, I wasn't along, but one of my colleagues was hiking up the trail that goes to Ouzel Falls, and there was a beaver hiking the trail at midnight. So they can move long distances over land, but they are vulnerable. So they can stay there near their parents or near their natal colony if there's sufficient habitat. If there's not, then they have to migrate. How can you keep that from becoming a point of conflict with non-public entities? I mean, from a river scientist perspective, the more the better in terms of beaver, as long as there's habitat for them. So it goes back to, how do you get people to accept beaver? How can you mitigate some of the potential conflicts with things like beaver deceivers and beaver pond levelers? And of course, there is a limited habitat. So I hope this doesn't sound disrespectful, but beavers are rodents. So they do produce a lot of kits every year, and there's a high rate of mortality. It varies. It's apparently something like 6 to 12 kits per year. So if there were no mortality from various causes, we would be overrun by very large rodents, but a lot of them die during that first year or two in particular. Another question, after the 2013 flood, Fish Creek beavers were either washed down the Big Thompson or they tried to live in Scott Ponds. Sherry Tippie relocated the Scott's Ponds beaver. The biggest obstacle she has encountered in her work is local government. Yeah, I'm not entirely surprised. It's local governments vary a lot in their acceptance of beavers. I know this is going to shock everybody, but Boulder is very accepting, for example. Some Front Range communities are not so much. There's also, it's not as though the local government is a monolith. So the natural areas and open space staff are often much more in favor than pay stormwater utilities folks are. It really varies with the situation. Here in Fort Collins, we have several active beaver colonies in natural areas and open spaces, and I think everybody's happy about that. In the Poudre, they can't build a dam that would persist anyway. It washes out at high flow. In Spring Creek, which is a major tributary of the Poudre, I don't think any have been actively removed, but the beaver don't tend to do very well if they're outside of the natural areas. Usually there's not enough food. But again, education and outreach to local government is important too. Another comment, more educational presentations like this one may help bridge the gap that John Guffey references. Yes, education is key, and too many of us, in quotation marks, have no frame of reference simply because we haven't taken the time to become educated about both sides of the issue. Well, yeah, we can all say that about ourselves for all sorts of issues. But there's a lot to learn and a lot of fascinating things that you can learn, and you can make a lot of difference. And that you're all active in this group, which is very important for land preservation. I think that's all I see in the chat, but any other questions that anyone has or comments?
Yeah, now's a good time. If anyone else would like to unmute themselves and ask Ellen a question, now's a great time to do that. While folks are considering that, Ellen, I just thinking about the future. I mean, you talked a lot about education. In order to expand the range of beaver, have more beaver in our flowing water systems. In addition to education, you said there's a new law that was passed in legislation just a few weeks ago. What else needs to change? What are the big barriers to getting back to that era when you'd see beaver throughout our river systems?
Well, it does come back to education or perception. I think thinking of river corridors as ecosystems and not just as simple channels that get water downstream quickly. Because if you start to think of it as an ecosystem, then you can think about things like protecting the riparian vegetation from whatever it may be that is threatening it. It could be domestic cattle, it could be moose and elk, it could be some other land use. But beaver need water and they need trees. I should explain, the woody vegetation is just very important for winter food. Beaver are completely vegetarians or herbivores. So they, like many of us, they eat more salads in the summer. They go to more herbaceous vegetation and forbs and things, but the woody vegetation is critical for seeing them through the winter. Winter is really hard. They can lose up to 40% of their body mass. And that's also a time of high mortality, and they just cannot survive in our winter if they don't have a food cache of things like aspen and willow and birch and some of those other deciduous species. You may see beaver chewing on pines. That's not good food for them. Beaver chew on a lot of things because their teeth keep growing throughout their lifetime, so they have to keep chewing. I came across a beaver skull several years ago on the South Fork Pooter, and their teeth start back here. It's like a giant semicircle. Then they grow down and they just keep growing. So they've got to keep chewing. So they will often chew. Oh, I've seen them chew cottonwoods with a diameter that's 3 feet or 4 feet. There's no way they're going to move that tree or use it in their dam, but it's a good chewing tool. So again, thinking about preserving river corridors as a whole.
Thank you. It looks like John has his hand up.
Thank you. So I've been visiting with some leaders in the community, and one in particular was saying that Estes Park maybe doesn't need as much open space because we can just go up in the park. And I'm very conscious of Estes Park as being a riparian habitat or a car. I mean, there are areas of the town that were taken away from the ecosystems that prevail here in nature. And I'm wondering, there's a big argument, there's a fight going on over land use in Estes Park. And I wonder to what extent your message could be carried back into the town. Like, it's very important to preserve nature in Rocky Mountain National Park or in habitats that are currently being preserved. But I'm having kind of a battle, if you will, of saying the park needs to grow. The park can't not just be this little island of preserved space. And Estes Park, sitting on the shoulder of Rocky Mountain National Park, should be an ally in that effort. And I don't know if there's any way to convert our society, starting with a community that is so well located, to be a messenger of change. And it's like, to me, that's the responsibility of Estes Park. Is that possibly something that you would encourage?
Absolutely. I'm trying to remember where I first read this. I think it may have been Rocky Times and Rocky Mountain National Park. I'm sure many of you have read that book, but they talk about why the elk like to come in and eat the flower gardens of people in Estes Park, because that was a key part of their winter range historically. My great grandmother was an unusually adventurous woman, and I grew up in Ohio, so my family's originally from Ohio, but she took the train across and went to Rocky Mountain National Park, and she preserved the things they gave them on the train, like the menus and the tourist brochures. So I have a picture of Estes Park that made me cry when I looked at it, because it's this beautiful mountain valley with almost no buildings. And if you take Mall Road, if you come up 34 and you cut across on Mall Road, look at the cut banks there. They're black soil. That was all beaver meadows, just downstream of what's now Lake Estes. So yeah, there's a lot of habitat that's critical there. And for many years, I worked on North St. Vrain all the way down to Button Rock Reservoir. And if I could go back in time and change some things, one of the things I would do would be to have Rocky Mountain, well, larger, it's a pretty small national park, but I would also have a preserved corridor all the way down to the base of the mountains. North St. Vrain is the closest we've got. If you think about all the other rivers, they've got a big road up them, and there's a lot of diversions. North St. Vrain is great until you hit Button Rock, which is still well inside the mountain front. But yeah, the diversity of habitat, the seasonal migration of animals like the elk and others, so having high and low habitats is critical. Anything you can do to protect Estes Park. You all know what's going on with human population growth in Colorado. It's slowed down, but it's still pretty high compared to most of the country. We have a limited window of opportunity, I think, to protect areas that aren't already protected. So yes, absolutely. I couldn't agree more strongly. And maybe I'll come back to Alice. I see the hand up, but there is one comment here. Oh, okay. No, these are just their comments. Jennifer Waters, the floodplain administrator for the town of Estes Park, absolutely support the presence of beavers to benefit floodplains, serve on the board of the EV Watershed Coalition. That's great. Thank you, Jennifer. And I'm guessing, since you're floodplain administrator for Estes Park, you may know Marcia Hilmas Robinson, who's the floodplain administrator for Fort Collins. She was one of my first master's students. But Alice, can I answer your question? I think you're muted. Yeah.
It's her husband who must admit I'm a extreme pessimist related to climate change. And when I look at the water management, not knowing that much about it, but right now the agricultural streams that run through the range don't have anything to cover for evaporation or groundwater absorption. And since I'm a pessimist, I'm looking at weird systems, and tell me if this is way off in left field. It probably is. But you cover, in order to decrease evaporation in lakes and possibly beaver ponds, you'd cover them with balls, styrofoam balls. And I'm just wondering if anybody has looked at beavers for what their tolerance is for that.
Not that I know of. There's only recently that people have tried to do a complete hydrologic balance for beaver meadows, because on the one hand, the ponded water is going to have a higher rate of evaporation, and there's a higher rate of transpiration, which is water loss from the plants in that meadow. On the other hand, you've got the water going into the subsurface, both the hyporheic zone and the groundwater. And it turns out that in the places where people have looked at this, partly because beavers don't live in deserts, it's a net gain. So you do have more water storage in the subsurface. But no, I know people are starting to look at different ways to cover standing water, or to put in things that would limit evaporation. But I haven't seen anyone do that for beaver dams. I don't know what their tolerance would be.
Well, I just wanted to thank you again for hosting this call today. Looks like we've run out of time, but you gave us so much to think about, and you mentioned a few books. You mentioned Lily Pond, you mentioned Eager, Beaverland, of course, In a Beaver World, which I think may be available at our library for those of you that haven't read that. I didn't write down the name of your book. It had the word damned in it, but I don't remember the full title. What was it again?
Saving the Damned.
Saving the Damned. And that was, I think, published just last year. Is that right?
2019.
2019. Yeah. Okay.
But
so still...
along with In Beaver World, it's the one that focuses on your local area. It was funny when I told my mother that title, she said, "Aren't you going to offend religious people?" I said, "Well, not if they can spell. It's DAMM."
And of course, we've talked a little bit about the land trust getting involved in maybe some wetland restoration work. We closed on the Childers amended conservation easement back in December. That is a site that Enos Mills wrote about in a Beaver World. So there may be an opportunity. There's no beaver there any longer. So, but the remnants of the beaver ponds are there, and hopefully we can schedule a site visit there for many of you. You can see it. You can see some of those areas that Ellen highlighted, these old berms, these earthen berms that are overgrown with vegetation. That one side there used to be a pond, and now it's sediment. So there could be an opportunity to explore reintroducing beaver there. Ellen's interested in that, or maybe some of her students. So that's something we'll continue to talk about. But I just wanted to thank all of you again for participating in the call this morning. This was fascinating. Beaver are such an amazing creature. We have beaver in Estes Park. They're not as numerous as they used to be, but look for them. I'm sure you'll see signs of them along the Big Thompson. I've heard there's bank beaver on the Big T north or upstream of town. There's beaver in the park. There's beaver on Fish Creek. So if you have some free time, go see if you can spot a beaver in Estes Park. And thanks again, everybody. Have a wonderful weekend. Stay in touch, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the good questions and comments.
Thank you, Ellen. Bye, everyone.
Bye all.